The decree was delivered on October 12, 1887, a day of brittle blue sky and a wind that carried the first true bite of the coming winter. Ilara Vance stood before the three men who constituted the entirety of the Providence Town Council, her hands clasped so tightly the knuckles showed white beneath her worn woolen shawl. She was 16 years old. Mr. Elias Henderson, her late husband's uncle and the town's largest landowner, read the verdict from a piece of paper, though he knew the words by heart. He had written them himself. His voice was a low, gravelly thing, accustomed to giving orders to farmhands and livestock, and it made no allowance for the girl who stood before him. The small plot of land, the 40 acres and the drafty two-room cabin that had been her husband's, and therefore hers, was to be reclaimed by the Henderson family estate. "The council finds," he stated, not looking at her, "that a girl of your tender age and lone status is unfit to manage the property. It is for your own protection. The land will revert to our stewardship. You will be permitted to remain in the cabin until the first hard frost, at which point you must find alternative lodging." Reverend Michael Miller, a man whose piety was exceeded only by his deference to Mr. Henderson, nodded gravely. "It is the proper course, my child. A woman alone is a temptation to Providence and a burden to the community. We will pray for you." The third man, Mr. Alistair Albright, who ran the general store and held the mortgage on nearly half the town, simply chewed on the stem of his unlit pipe and stared at a point on the wall just over her head. His silence was its own form of consent, a quiet calculation of assets and liabilities. Ilara Vance was a liability. She had been an orphan when she married Thomas Vance at 15, a union of practicality that had offered her a sliver of security in a world that offered none. When a runaway plow horse had taken Thomas from her just 8 months later, that security had vanished. Now, the men of Providence were taking the sliver too. She had no family to turn to, no savings beyond the $47 in silver coins sewn into the hem of her dress. The first hard frost was, at most, 3 weeks away. They were not offering her shelter. They were sentencing her to it. Ilara did not weep. She did not plead. The part of her that might have done so had been scoured away by a life that had been a constant subtraction of warmth and love. She simply gave a single, sharp nod, turned on her heel, and walked out of the council meeting held in the back room of Albright's store. The cold wind that greeted her outside felt like a confirmation. The world was hard and indifferent, and survival was a solitary occupation. As she walked the dusty track back toward the cabin that would soon be denied to her, her gaze fell upon the Henderson fields, where 3 colossal haystacks stood like ancient, sleeping beasts against the skyline. They were monuments of prairie wealth, each one representing tons of compressed timothy and alfalfa, feed for the Henderson cattle through the long, brutal Nebraska winter. And in their immense, silent forms, an idea, born of desperation and a half-forgotten memory, began to take root. The memory was of her grandfather, a man who had come from the wind-swept plains of the Old World, a place where winters were things of legend. He used to speak of houses made not of wood, which was scarce, but of the earth itself. He spoke of the insulating power of snow, of the thermal mass of packed sod, and of how the wisest creatures did not fight the cold, but burrowed into the landscape and let the earth's own blanket protect them. He had once idly remarked, while watching men build a haystack, that a man could live through any storm if he were sealed in the heart of such a thing. It had been the fanciful talk of an old man, but for Ilara, standing on the precipice of homelessness in winter, it became a blueprint. She spent the next 2 days in a quiet flurry of activity that went unnoticed by the town. Her first stop was not Mr. Albright's store, where her presence would invite questions, but the neighboring settlement of Harmony, a full day's walk away. The $47 felt like a leaden weight in her dress, the last material anchor to her former life. She inventoried her needs with a grim, methodical precision. Heat was paramount. Survival was a question of thermodynamics. In Harmony's hardware emporium, she purchased a small, pot-bellied cast-iron stove, the kind used in rail cabooses. It cost $12, a staggering sum that made her flinch. 6 lengths of interlocking stovepipe cost another $3. She bought a sturdy, second-hand shovel with a strong ash handle for $1.50, a small handsaw, and a box of 10-penny nails. Her most critical purchase was a large roll of treated canvas, the kind used for wagon covers, which set her back another $4. Finally, she spent her remaining coins on staples: flour, salt, beans, smoked bacon, and a small tin of coffee. The walk back, laden with her awkward and heavy salvation, was grueling. Every muscle in her young frame ached, but the pain was a distraction from the cold knot of fear in her stomach. The total expenditure was $27. She had $20 left, a fortune she would not touch unless it was a matter of life or death. Her plan crystallized during that long, solitary journey. She would not simply burrow into the haystack like an animal. She would engineer a dwelling. It would be a structure within a structure, a void shaped by logic and reinforced against the immense pressure of the surrounding mass. She selected the largest of the 3 Henderson haystacks, the one furthest from the main road and shielded from view by a small copse of barren cottonwood trees. It was a behemoth, at least 35 feet in diameter at its base and rising to a conical peak nearly 25 feet high. It had been built in late summer, its core densely packed by the weight of its own accumulation, the outer layers forming a thatch that shed water like a roof. Before she made the first cut, she faced the men of Providence one last time. It was not a confrontation she sought, but one that found her. Mr. Henderson, riding his horse along the perimeter of his vast property, saw her near the stack, her newly purchased tools laid out on the canvas. He reined in his horse, his shadow falling over her like a judgment. "What is the meaning of this, girl?" he boomed, his voice laced with impatience. "Are you planning on stealing my hay?" Alara stood up, wiping her dusty hands on her skirt. "No, Mr. Henderson. I am preparing my winter lodging." He stared, his brow furrowed in disbelief. Then he laughed, a harsh, barking sound. "Your lodging? What are you talking about?" "I will live inside the haystack," she said, her voice even and calm. It was a statement of fact, not a plea for permission. Henderson's laughter died, replaced by a look of profound irritation. "Do not be a fool. You will do no such thing. That is my property. You will suffocate, or freeze, or set the whole thing ablaze. I forbid it." "With respect, sir," Alara said, her gaze unwavering, "the council's order was that I vacate the cabin. It did not specify where I must go. You are not using this stack until the deep winter, and by then, I will be gone. I will not damage your hay, and I will be perfectly safe." Her quiet confidence seemed to enrage him more than any argument would have. By the next afternoon, he had returned, this time with Reverend Miller in tow. The Reverend approached her with an air of paternalistic concern, his hands clasped behind his back. "My dear child," he began, his tone soft and condescending, "we are worried for you. This notion is, well, it is born of grief and desperation. It is unnatural. Man is meant to live in houses of wood and stone under the sight of God. To burrow like a mole is an act of despair, a turning away from civilized Christian life." "It is an act of survival, Reverend," Alara replied, not pausing in her work of sharpening the teeth of her new saw. "I have no house of wood and stone. God has provided the field and the hay. I believe he expects me to use the wits he gave me." "It is a tomb you are building," the Reverend insisted, his voice rising. "You will run out of air. The night dampness will seep in and steal the breath from your lungs. Or worse, a spark from this mad contraption you intend to install will turn you into a funeral pyre. It is a form of suicide, and that is a mortal sin." Mr. Henderson scoffed. "Let her be, Reverend. Folly must be allowed to run its course. She will last one night before the cold and the mice drive her out, begging for a space in a barn. Then she will understand the wisdom of our decision." He looked down at Alara, his eyes cold and devoid of pity. "You have until the first snow. When you come to your senses, do not come to my door." With that, they left her, convinced of her inevitable, pitiable failure. Their dismissal was a greater permission than any consent they could have granted. They did not believe she could do it, and so they would not stop her. The work began on October 18th, 1887. The first task was the most physically demanding, creating the entrance. She chose a spot on the southeastern face of the stack, the side least likely to face the brutal northwesterly winds. The outer layer of hay was loose, but a foot in, it became a wall of immense density, compressed by the tons of material above it. She used the saw to cut large rectangular blocks, each about 2 feet wide, 3 feet long, and a foot thick. They were astonishingly heavy. She would saw the outlines, then use the shovel as a lever to pry them free. It was slow, exhausting labor that left her hands blistered and her back screaming in protest. For 2 days, she did nothing but cut and haul these blocks, moving them away from the entrance to create a clear workspace. She carved a tunnel, 4 feet high and 3 feet wide, pushing it straight toward the center of the stack. The air inside was thick with the sweet, dusty smell of cured grass, and the light from the entrance barely penetrated more than a few feet. It was claustrophobic, silent work. The only sounds the rasp of her saw and her own ragged breathing. Once the tunnel extended about 6 feet into the stack, she began to excavate the main chamber. Her design was precise. A room 10 feet long and 8 feet wide, with a ceiling that vaulted to a height of 7 feet at its center. This was not a random burrow. It was a feat of engineering. As she cut the hay blocks from the ceiling and walls of this emerging chamber, she did not discard them. Instead, she began to use them as building materials. She lined the interior walls of the chamber with the most uniform blocks, stacking them like massive, fibrous bricks. This process served 2 purposes. It created smooth, stable interior walls, and, more importantly, it further compressed the hay around her, increasing its structural integrity and insulating properties. By the end of the first week, she had a hollow, block-lined cavern in the heart of the haystack. The sheer weight of the hay above her was a constant, terrifying presence in her mind. A collapse would not be survivable. The next phase of construction was designed to prevent that catastrophic failure. From the nearby cottonwood copse, she scavenged for fallen timber. She found several sturdy trunks, about 6 inches in diameter, which she laboriously sawed into sections. 4 of these became upright posts, which she set at the corners of her chamber, digging their bases firmly into the compressed hay floor. 2 longer, thicker logs were hoisted into place atop these posts, serving as the main ceiling beams. Across these, she laid smaller branches, creating a rudimentary but strong sub-roof. This wooden skeleton, a house within the hay, would bear the primary load, ensuring the space would remain intact. The cost was nothing but sweat and aching muscles. The most dangerous and complex task was the installation of the stove and chimney. As Reverend Miller had pointed out, a single spark could be fatal. Alara had considered this more carefully than he could ever imagine. Her solution was a testament to her meticulous nature. She would not allow the hot stovepipe to make direct contact with the hay at any point. She began by creating a base for the stove, a platform of packed earth and flat stones she carried from a nearby creek bed. This would insulate the floor from the stove's heat. For the chimney, she designed and built a device she called a thimble. Using scraps of tin left near an old abandoned smithy and a bucket of clay mixed with water and grass, she fashioned a double-walled cylinder. It was a pipe within a pipe, 12 inches in diameter on the outside and 8 inches on the inside. She packed the 2-inch space between the walls tightly with wet clay. This contraption would be her firewall. She carefully carved a vertical shaft directly upward from where the stove would sit, passing through more than 6 feet of compressed hay to the open air. The process was nerve-wracking. She worked from a small, rickety ladder, sawing and digging upward into the dense darkness. Once the shaft was clear, she painstakingly inserted her clay and tin thimble. It was a tight fit, as she had intended. She sealed both the top and bottom with another thick layer of clay, ensuring no hay could ever touch the inner passage where the hot stovepipe would run. Finally, she assembled the 6 lengths of stovepipe, feeding them up through the thimble until the final, capped piece extended 2 feet above the top of the haystack. From the outside, it looked like a strange metal mushroom sprouting from the golden mound. Ventilation was the final piece of the scientific puzzle. She knew that a fire consumed air, and that without a fresh supply, it would sicken her with its fumes before it suffocated her. She carved a second, much smaller channel near the floor, on the opposite side of the chamber from the stove. This intake vent, only 4 inches in diameter, was baffled. She created a winding path for it, stuffing the channel with loose straw, which would allow air to seep through slowly, but would prevent a direct, freezing draft. Her grandfather had explained the principle of convection to her once. The hot air rising from the stove would draw fresh, cold air through this intake vent, creating a constant, gentle circulation. The chamber would breathe. On November 5th, the first hard frost finally descended, glazing the prairie in a brittle layer of white. As promised, Mr. Henderson arrived at the cabin in his wagon. He did not get down. He simply sat and watched as Alara removed her few remaining possessions: a thin mattress, a wooden crate containing her mother's quilt and a few books, a cast-iron skillet, and a lantern. She loaded them onto a small handcart she had repaired. She did not look at him as she pulled the cart toward the haystack, her back straight, her face a mask of determined neutrality. She left the cabin door open, a final, silent act of relinquishment. That evening, as the temperature plummeted and a cruel wind scoured the plains, Alara Vance lit the first fire in her new home. She used only a few small pieces of wood, and the effect was immediate and astonishing. The small stove, radiating heat in all directions, began to warm the chamber. There were no drafts. The thick, seamless walls of compressed hay, which she calculated to be at least 10 feet thick in every direction, were a near-perfect insulator. The silence was absolute. The howling of the wind, a sound she had always dreaded in the drafty cabin, was completely inaudible. Here, in the warm, still heart of the stack, there was only the gentle crackle of the fire and the faint, sweet smell of hay. She had lined the floor with the heavy canvas, and on top of that, her mattress. Her crate served as a table and pantry. A single nail in one of the wooden posts held her lantern, its soft glow filling the small space. She cooked bacon and beans in her skillet on the stovetop, the savory smell a comforting domesticity in this most undomesticated of homes. The principles her grandfather had spoken of were not just stories. They were physical laws: thermal mass, insulation, convection. They were as real and as solid as the wooden beams above her head. She had not built a burrow, she had built a sanctuary. Life within the haystack settled into a quiet, methodical rhythm. Ilara spent her days gathering firewood from the cottonwood grove, venturing out only when the weather was clear. She learned the nuances of her dwelling. A small, slow-burning fire was all that was needed to keep the chamber at a comfortable temperature, even when the world outside was frozen solid. The hay walls seemed to absorb and hold the heat, radiating it back at her long after the fire had died down to embers. She read her books by lantern light, the Bible, a tattered copy of Shakespeare, and a farmer's almanac. Her world shrunk to the 8 by 10 foot space she had carved for herself. The people of Providence mostly forgot her. She was a ghost, a cautionary tale that had conveniently removed itself from sight. Children sometimes dared each other to run up to the haystack to see if the strange metal pipe was smoking, and when it was, they would run back to town with tales of the hay witch. Mr. Albright, at the general store, occasionally sold a few supplies to a young boy from a neighboring farm whom Ilara paid to make her purchases, preserving her isolation. Once, Reverend Miller mentioned her in a sermon, a vague allusion to the lost sheep who choose the wilderness over the flock, whose pride leads them to a cold and lonely end. The congregation nodded, secure in their wooden houses, their larders full, their faith as solid and unyielding as the frozen ground outside. Not one of them had lost a family member to the indifference of their neighbors. Not one of them had burned through their meager wood supply trying to heat a poorly built cabin against a 30-mile-per-hour wind. And not one of them would ever admit they might have been wrong. December came and went, a month of deep cold and skittering snows. Ilara remained safe and warm. January of 1888 arrived with a strange, unsettling mildness. On the morning of January 12th, the temperature was so warm that a thaw began. The snow on the prairie turned to slush, and farmers who had been confined to their homes for weeks ventured out, believing the worst of winter had passed. In Providence, Mr. Henderson called a special midday meeting at the church to discuss plans for spring planting. Reverend Miller was there, of course, as was Mr. Albright and a dozen other men from the town and surrounding farms. They were optimistic, their conversation filled with the promise of an early thaw and a profitable year. Shortly after noon, the sky began to change. A strange, leaden-gray pallor spread from the northwest, swallowing the pale blue. The temperature, which had been a pleasant 34 degrees Fahrenheit, began to drop with an unnatural speed. Within an hour, it had fallen to 0. The wind, which had been a mild breeze, suddenly shifted and began to howl, a rising, malevolent shriek. Then the snow began. It was not a gentle flurry, but a blinding, horizontal wall of ice and powder, hurled from the sky by a wind that was now gusting to over 60 miles per hour. This was no ordinary winter storm. This was a phenomenon the likes of which the settlers had never experienced. It would later be known as the schoolhouse blizzard, a storm that materialized out of a seemingly mild day with the speed and fury of a physical attack. Inside her shelter, Ilara knew something was wrong long before the storm reached its peak. The gentle breathing of her intake vent had changed to a low moan, and she could feel a faint vibration through the very floor of her dwelling. She added more wood to the stove, secured the simple wooden plank that served as her door, and settled in to wait. Outside, the world had ceased to exist, replaced by a roaring, white chaos. The temperature plunged to 20 below 0, then 30, then an almost unthinkable 40 degrees below 0. The wind chill made it feel like 70 below. It was a cold that killed. In the Providence Church, the mood had shifted from optimism to alarm, and then to to outright fear. The church was a large, drafty building, constructed with more piety than insulation. The single large stove in the center of the room fought a losing battle against the cold that poured through the thin walls and ill-fitting window frames. The men piled wood into it, but the ferocious wind was sucking the heat up the chimney as fast as the stove could produce it. The windows were completely whited out, and the sound of the wind was a deafening, continuous roar, punctuated by the sharp crack of freezing timbers. By 4 o'clock in the afternoon, they knew they were trapped. It was impossible to see more than a foot in front of one's face. The short walk to any of their homes was a death sentence. They would become disoriented and freeze within minutes. Their only hope was to wait out the storm in the church. But the storm was not abating. If anything, its fury was increasing. And the woodpile, stacked in a lean-to against the back wall of the church, was dwindling at an alarming rate. By nightfall, the situation was dire. The temperature inside the church was now well below freezing. The men huddled together near the stove, which now offered only a pathetic circle of warmth, its glow a flickering defiance against the encroaching, deadly cold. Their breath plumed in the air. Their hands and feet were numb. Despair began to set in. They spoke of their families, trapped in their own homes, and wondered if they were faring any better. It was a young farmer named Samuel, a man who had only been in the territory for a year, who first spoke the thought that was slowly, uncomfortably, dawning in the minds of the others. His teeth were chattering uncontrollably, his face pale in the lantern light. "The girl," he stammered, his words barely audible over the shriek of the wind. "Henderson's niece, the one in the haystack." A silence fell over the huddled group. They all looked at Mr. Henderson. The landowner's face was grim, his usual arrogance stripped away by the primitive fear of freezing to death. He had publicly mocked her. He had called her a fool. Reverend Miller spoke, his voice thin and reedy. "It is madness. She has surely perished. No one could survive this out in the open." "But she ain't in the open," Samuel insisted, a desperate hope in his voice. "She's inside it, insulated. She has a stove. I seen the smoke. It might be warm in there." The idea, once spoken aloud, was impossible to dismiss. They were slowly freezing to death in a house of God, while the girl they had condemned to live like an animal might be the only person for miles who was truly safe. The irony was a bitter pill, but survival was a more powerful force than pride. "The stack is only a quarter-mile from here," another man said. "We could follow the fence line. If we tie ourselves together with the bell rope, we might not get separated." It was a desperate gamble. To leave the marginal shelter of the church for the maelstrom outside was to risk immediate death. But to stay was to accept a slower, colder one. Mr. Henderson looked at the faces of the men around him, their expressions a mixture of fear and pleading. He looked at the stove, where the last few pieces of wood were turning to ash. His pride had frozen solid and cracked apart. "Get the rope," he said, his voice a hoarse croak. The journey from the church to the haystack was a descent into a frozen hell. They tied the thick bell rope around their waists, a chain of 15 desperate men. Mr. Henderson took the lead. The moment they opened the church door, the storm hit them like a solid object. The wind tore the breath from their lungs, and the snow, as fine and sharp as sand, blasted any exposed skin. They could not see the fence, which was only 20 feet away. They stumbled forward, blind, leaning into the wind, their hands outstretched, until Henderson's mittened fingers brushed against the frozen wire. They followed it hand over hand, a slow, agonizing crawl through a world that had been reduced to 3 elements: the howling wind, the blinding white, and the biting, relentless cold. More than once, a man would slip and fall, pulled back from oblivion only by the rope that bound him to the others. They did not speak, It was impossible. All their energy was focused on the next step, the next handhold on the frozen wire fence. It was a journey of only a quarter mile, but it felt like an eternity. They were guided by a collective memory of the landscape, a desperate faith that Henderson's field and the giant haystack were in the direction they were heading. After what seemed like a lifetime, Henderson stumbled not forward, but upward. He had run into the base of the haystack. It was a wall, a mountain of white in the swirling chaos. He screamed, his voice instantly snatched away by the wind, and tugged on the rope. The men collapsed against the base of the stack, shielded for the first time from the direct assault of the wind. They were half frozen, their beards and eyebrows caked in ice. Several were on the verge of collapse. They fumbled their way around the massive circumference of the stack, searching for the entrance Ilara had made. They almost missed it. It was a small, dark opening, nearly drifted over with snow. Henderson fell to his knees and pounded on the thick wooden plank that served as a door. He used his fists, his shoulders, any strength he had left. It was the frantic, desperate drumming of a dying man begging for entry into his own tomb. Inside, Ilara was startled from her reading by the dull, rhythmic thudding. It was a sound that did not belong in her silent world. At first, she thought it was a trick of the wind, a strange acoustic resonance within the hay. But it was too regular, too insistent. Fear pricked at her. No one knew she was here. No one would come for her. With her heart pounding, she moved the heavy bar that secured her door and pulled the plank inward. The storm flooded the entrance, a swirling vortex of snow and a blast of cold so intense it was like a physical blow. Framed in the opening was a figure so covered in ice and snow it was barely human. It was Mr. Henderson. Behind him, other figures were visible, stumbling, collapsing, all bound together by a rope. They looked like ghosts, specters from a frozen nightmare. For a moment, no one moved. Henderson stared into the warm, softly lit interior, his eyes wide with disbelief. He saw not a filthy animal burrow, but a clean, orderly room. He saw the small black stove radiating a visible shimmer of heat. He saw a pot of coffee steaming on its surface. He saw a girl, her face calm and serious, looking back at him. He saw salvation. Ilara stepped back, holding the door open. "Come in," she said, her voice clear and steady. "Quickly!" They stumbled inside, one by one, a frozen, shuffling procession of the town's most important men. They untied the rope and collapsed onto the canvas-covered floor, moaning and shivering. The contrast between the outside and the inside was staggering, a physical shock to their systems. Out there was a roaring, lethal chaos. In here, it was perhaps 70 degrees, utterly still and silent save for the crackle of the fire. The air smelled of warm hay, wood smoke, and coffee. Ilara moved with a quiet efficiency that commanded a silent respect. She barred the door again, shutting out the storm. She poured hot coffee into her 2 tin cups, giving them to the men who were shivering the most violently. She instructed others to remove their frozen boots and rub their feet to restore circulation. She said little, but her actions were clear and authoritative. She was not the helpless girl they had cast out. She was the master of this domain, the sole arbiter of their survival. Mr. Henderson, his back against a warm wall of hay, watched her. He saw the ingenious wooden frame that held the ceiling. He saw the clever clay-lined thimble through which the stovepipe passed safely. He saw the small, baffled vent that allowed the room to breathe. He saw not madness, but a profound and humbling wisdom. He saw a structure born not of folly, but of a deep, practical understanding of the natural world, a knowledge that he and all the other men, with their wooden houses and their arrogant assumptions, had completely lacked. They had built against the winter. She had built with it. They remained in the haystack for 2 full days. The blizzard raged without pause, a relentless assault on the prairie. Ilara shared what food she had: beans, bacon, and hard biscuits. It was not much, but with the hot coffee, it was enough. The men, stripped of their authority and social standing, were reduced to a common denominator of humanity. They were simply survivors, guests in the home of the young woman they had wronged. They spoke little. The enormity of their misjudgment and the sheer miracle of their rescue, leaving no room for casual conversation. Reverend Miller sat hunched near the stove, his gaze fixed on the flames, perhaps contemplating the mysterious ways in which God chose his instruments of salvation. On the morning of the 3rd day, January 14th, they awoke to a profound silence. The wind had stopped. Ilara unbarred the door and pushed it open to a transformed world. The sky was a brilliant, painful blue. The sun shone on a landscape buried under immense drifts of snow, some as high as the rooftops of their houses. The air was still and brutally cold, but the storm was over. The walk back to Providence was a somber pilgrimage through a scene of devastation. They found neighbors frozen in their homes, their wood supplies exhausted. They found livestock dead in their barns. They found a family who had tried to make a run for a neighbor's house, their bodies buried in a drift just 50 yards from safety. The schoolhouse blizzard had killed over 200 people across the plains, many of them children caught walking home from school. The town of Providence had not been spared. 6 families had lost someone. The final death toll for their small community was 11 souls. In the weeks that followed, a quiet and permanent change settled over the town. The story of how 15 of its leading men had been saved by the Hay Witch became a local legend, told in hushed, reverent tones. Ilara Vance was no longer an outcast. She was a sage. On the first day of spring, Mr. Elias Henderson, accompanied by the entire town council, approached the haystack. Ilara met them outside. Henderson did not offer a simple apology. He held out a deed, legally signed and sealed. It was for the original 40 acres and the cabin, but it also included an additional 100 acres of his own prime pasture land. With it was a bank draft for $500. "The land is yours, Ilara," he said, his voice thick with an emotion she had never heard from him before. Free and clear. "This is to build a proper house, a good one. We would be honored if you would teach us how to build it." Ilara accepted the papers. She looked from the deed to the great haystack that had been her home and her salvation. It stood, slightly slumped now with the coming thaw, the thin metal stovepipe still pointing at the sky. It was a monument, not to her own ingenuity, but to a simple, forgotten truth: that wisdom is sometimes found not in the grand designs of men, but in the quiet, resilient logic of the natural world. Her vindication was absolute, but it was a somber victory, earned at the cost of 11 lives that need not have been lost. The prairie was a harsh teacher, and its lessons, once learned, were never forgotten.